So that's happening. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me for this. So this is going to be interesting because two of you already have experienced this method in the flesh for God knows how many years, and two of you know nothing about what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to try and walk in the middle and first start with, oh, here's Lily. And first talk about the method sort of generally and just to give you the basic steps. And then I guess the second half, I really want to open it up to discussion and questions because that's really the more interesting. Hi, Lily. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to share my screen. And of course, that screen is now gone. That's perfect. Hold on. Here we go. Can you guys all see this? Okay. All right. So I'm going to zoom you all in here in Mr. Horowitz. And I always start the discussion of this method with this quote because I really think that perspective here is everything. So what is he saying? For the virtuoso, musical works are in fact nothing but tragic and moving materializations of his emotions. He is called upon to make them speak, weep, sing, and sigh, to recreate them in accordance with his own consciousness. In this way, he, like the composer, is a creator, for he must have within himself those passions that he wishes to bring so intensely to life. You see, playing the piano is a combination of brain, heart, and means, and all three should be even. If one falls short of the others, the music suffers. Without brains, you're a fiasco. Without means, you're an amateur. Without heart, you're a machine. It has its dangers, this occupation. And I love this quote because this is exactly the module that, not the module, the structure that I want everybody to consider when they start talking about emotion in music. Ideal performance is made out of this Venn diagram, an understanding of the structural, of the structure of the music, how the piece is constructed, the harmonies, the phrasing, the tempi, the style, anything that goes under the actual musical structure, how the piece is constructed. Technique, the ability to get those notes out into the open. I think we usually associate technique with, the difficult passages, but technique is just the ability to produce a sound. So if we can't produce a sound, if we can't press our fingers, if we can't, sing a line, then there's no technique, there's nothing. There is no music without technique. And then emotion is sort of the black sheep in the family because nobody wants to talk about it. It's difficult to pinpoint what exactly emotion is in the context of of a performance of a piece of music. We're all different, so we're going to experience differently. People have very different opinions about what happens emotionally in a piece of music. So it's sort of left most of the time out of the equation. And I think it's imperative that we agree that, hold on, two more people. Okay. It's imperative that when we consider a successful performance, that we consider all three: a structural understanding of the music, a technical ability to produce those notes, and bringing some emotion into the fold. Questions about any of this? Or please feel free to unmute yourselves and interrupt me. I really want this to be a discussion and not so much me talking at you. Or you, of course, can also, where's the chat? What happened to the chat? Okay, never mind. So the 5 steps of the emotional understanding method. I came up with this method really because I felt that in my schooling at Juilliard, of course, technique was the thing that kept us all busy. I was suffering from a hand injury, so I had to change my technique. Structure is what we teach in theory classes, so that was big emphasis there. And emotion sort of was left under this subheading of talent. If you're talented and you're musical, then you got that down. We don't need to talk about it. Just, put in your special sauce and everything should be great. And of course, once you start fussing with technique and you change things, and once you're obsessing about being stylistically accurate and understanding the musical structure, emotion again sort of takes the back seat and gets left behind. And so when I got into the doctoral program, my mission was I'm going to reintroduce emotion back into the matrix, back into this equation, and I'm going to look at the performance through these three lenses and see what I get. But the thing that really bothered me was that there was no systematic way of looking at what is emotion in music. And so I came up with this methodology. And the methodology has 5 steps. Step number 1, what's the piece's overall emotion, connotations, and associations? What does that mean? If you think of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, is that a happy piece or a sad piece? It's a happy piece. How happy? Kind of joyful, right? Jingle Bells gets more, right? Ode to Joy with the chorus and with the full statement, like we really reach very high on the joy scale to something that is much more extreme. And I'll go into more detail with each one of these steps in a second. I just want to do an overall. The second step is dividing the piece into smaller sections. And those smaller sections, again, can be whatever you want the smaller sections to be. It can be a phrase. It can be the first theme. It can be the first appearance of something. It's really up to you to decide how deep you want to go. But second step actually requires you to divide the piece into smaller sections. And then we start assigning emotions to those separate sections. And you'll see how that is done in a second. The third step is to decide how much emotion. And I can't stress this enough, because for a lot of us, deciding how much emotion we want to express in a given section is a really big issue. People have very different opinions about how much is too much and how much is not enough. So deciding on the actual boundaries of the emotion is critical. And the last 2 steps are basically, how are we going to connect to the joy in the music or to the sadness in the music? Are we going to use a personal story? Are we going to use an experience we've actually had? Are we going to use our imagination? Are we going to use our imagination? Are we going to maybe use colors, maybe use just an adjective, just the word? How are we personally going to connect to these emotions? And the 5th step, which may sound bizarre in this context, but how are we going to detach from the emotion? And the reason for that is that when we're going on stage and before I say that, the reason why we want to learn detachment is because we want to make sure that the listener is actually experiencing what we intended them to experience. And I'm sure you all know the performances that somebody seems like they're having, a religious experience on stage, and we stay flat. We're like, I'm not buying it. And the performances that somebody's going on stage and just being very, very calm and very simple, and they become very moving because of something that they're doing. So this idea of balance between involvement and detachment is critical when we look at this methodology. So let's jump in. First step, general definition. So I like this. There isn't much that I like about Bud's book, and I think I shared the link, and I'll share the link with you again to this map. But the title of the book, which I used heavily in my dissertation, is called Music and the Emotions, the Philosophical Theories, Malcolm Budd. It's a very thorough book. I have a lot of issues with it, but this is not the topic of this conversation. But I still like what Budd says here in this quote. It is clear that an emotional characterization of a piece of music as joyful, triumphant, mournful can be correct, and it can be incorrect. Furthermore, an incorrect characterization can be indicative of a failure of appreciation of the music. So what is he saying? Ezra, what is Bud saying here?
Sorry, let me reread that again. Oh, it's saying that like music is very subjective, and I guess whatever is correct to you, like the interpretation of a piece could be wildly different for someone else.
Right, but he's saying something even further. He's saying that there is a right and wrong when we identify the basic emotion behind the piece. And I think that could be explosive for a lot of people to say, that Ode to Joy is happy, period. Maybe somebody disagrees with us. Maybe somebody thinks that Ode to Joy is actually a very tragic piece. Now, I agree with, but I think that would be a ridiculous, ludicrous definition or position to take on something that is so clearly a happy piece. But I think this gets a little bit more difficult when you get into more ambiguous waters with pieces that could be perceived as different emotion, or the dominant emotion can be different for different people.
Right. I mean, A Clockwork Orange used Ode to Joy as like horror for the main character.
Right, because now he's looking at more meanings underneath the music. Or Shostakovich's pieces, absolutely. The veneer is very happy, you know, polka rhythms, and underneath you hear, you know, Stalin lurking in the back somewhere. So
Yeah.
it's really important that when we look at this step, that we examine, is there an absolute truth for the piece we are looking at? Is there something written by the composer that will give us a better assessment of what the intention is? And if not, we just have to go out there and we have to make a decision. And the example I gave here is of 4 Scarlatti sonatas that I played as a group. And this step was very, very helpful in saying, you know, the E major Scarlatti sonata was sort of peaceful. It had some shadow, but it wasn't too tragic. The B minor Scarlatti sonata was much more depressing, was much more mournful and sad. The D minor was angry, and the C major was peaceful again. And so in combining the 4, I sort of made it easy for myself to get in, drop down, and climb back up again. The general definition, the identification of the emotions in the Scarlatti sonatas allowed for a much smoother performance in terms of the emotional curve of the pieces. To contrast it, if I started with the B minor, that is much more tragic, when I go on stage, I have to start dropping down levels to be able to connect to that more tragic emotion, and then I would have climbed out if the order was different. Any questions about this? Or does this seem sort of like, you know, Susan, go. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say something you're bringing up in my mind is that I always wondered about all of the church modes and, you know, how people in the past viewed keys and what the keys meant to them, because I think they were related to emotions.
There's a lot of stuff written about this, and I guess the problem is, if you know that Mozart is writing in A major, and for Mozart, A major is sort of pastoral nature kind of emotions, does that help you play the music better? Obviously, to some extent, yes. Or, you know, Beethoven in C minor is such a, you know, that's a dissertation in itself between the, you know, the Fifth Symphony and the piano concerto and the Pathétique and the last sonata. There's sort of C minor for Beethoven is this epic key of a struggle. Some would say fate and, you know, fate, destiny, and what have you. And some people would say, well, just, you know, it's an intense key for him.
Mm-hmm.
I personally don't like to pigeonhole and say this is this and that is that. But again, if you're reading about a specific composer and you realize that they have a specific connection to that key, that could be very, very helpful. Obviously.
Do you know what key the you know, Ode to Joy? I can't think of what key it's in.
Well, the symphony is in D. I think it's F, if I'm not mistaken. But we can.
You're not teaching piano class, and we play it in D.
Right. But and if you really, I mean, this is a rabbit hole, so I'm going to stop in a second. But
yeah,
the pitch actually changed from Bach's time. Like his A is not our A anymore. So
right.
What we're hearing maybe is B flat major and not A major anymore.
Right. Okay.
So again, I think we just have to be very careful when we assign the meaning because somebody told us the meaning. I think the meaning should come from us. If you feel that I don't know, the you know, the certain Chopin mazurka is tragic, it's tragic for you. If you feel it's just melancholy, it's melancholy. If you feel that it's a sweet and sour, it's joyful and melancholy, that's what it is for you. The point of this step is for you to take a position about what the piece is about.
Right, and every person is different, and humanity is evolving, and so those things are going.
And voila, exactly. Second step. I like this picture. Look at this wave. The emotional wave and stations. What's the point? The point is that we draw a circle and we start placing the different, let me make this bigger so you can see. We start drawing circles to represent the different emotions in the piece. So let's say, just taking Beethoven Fifth as an example, the first theme, pa 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 pam, I'm deciding that it's anger. For me, that theme is very angry. I'm going to place it below the middle line in the circle in negative emotions. The second theme, ta-da-da-da-dee-da-da-da, much more loving, much more tender, above the middle line in the circle in positive emotions. And this is where I think it gets really interesting, because for some of us, the opening of Beethoven's Fifth will be placed lower. We would feel it much darker. For some of us, well, it's just the beginning of the piece. We don't really know. We might place it higher. For some people, the second theme, it's calm, it's gentle. We'll place it somewhere over here. For some other people, it's so radical from the C minor. The E flat theme is so much more peaceful and loving and has motion and tenderness that they would place it higher. There is no right and wrong here. And I'm going to probably say this again and again and again and again. It's the proportions that you feel are appropriate in the music. Am I landing that point? Is that clear to everybody? Yeah. This gets really interesting when you start in comparing the first theme as it appears in the piece. The first time it appears, then in the recapitulation, and then of course in the coda. And I think what you see very clearly is that there is intensification of that theme. It gets progressively angrier and more turbulent and more fatalistic, and whichever adjective you want to assign to it, it just gets more of that emotion. How does that help us as performers? Just knowing that we're going to have to travel down with the piece, that we're going to have to start with anger, get angrier, and get really, really violent by the end, helps us go on stage and know what trajectory we're going to perform. Now, of course, this is just the first theme. We have to do it for the entire piece. So I'm going to zoom out for a second and show you what it looks like in Chopin Mazurka, which hopefully we're going to have time to hear. But it ends up looking something like this. The first theme is pain. It gets worse, maybe comes up. The middle section, the trio is joyful, so it gets progressively higher. And the end of the piece takes us down again. So this is the emotional wave, the trajectory the piece unfolds in, and sort of the major areas of emotion, whether it's pain and sadness, happiness and joy, and then more pain and sadness at the end. We see that we're not staying static, that constantly there is a wave, there's an up and down, there's an evolution to the themes. Any questions about this? Yeah, Kim.
What are the circles outside the circle?
Good question. To me, in this specific mazurka, the opening seems completely detached of the actual piece. It's an introduction that four measures at the beginning and four measures at the end. It's detached from the emotional reality of the piece. So I just decided to say, at the beginning, it sounds to me like something that is very peaceful and optimistic, but it's not really connected to the narration of the piece. And I hopefully will have a chance to hear it. You get to see what I mean. I usually put things outside of the circle when I think that there are more emotional levels. There isn't just one narrative that is going chronologically, but there is some ideas that are outside of that narrative. Does that answer the question? Kind of. Okay.
I have a question about like detachment.
Yep.
So like you might be getting to this, so sorry for being redundant, but do you have any like tools or exercises to, I guess, practice detaching from the piece? Because I feel like if I live in music that I'm playing or even that I'm listening to, like I get too bogged down by those emotions or like involved, so then the circle just gets bigger and then like the trajectory is like a lot smaller.
Hold that thought. When we get to detachment, we're going to dig deeper into that. Okay.
Gotcha.
So the second stage was draw these circles, decide on the relationship between them according to how the piece is unfolding. I put this, I don't even know to call it. This is somebody's position about what's more positive and what's more negative. So you can see they start with optimism, happiness, freedom being sort of the highest form of positive emotions. And of course, the negatives are here, pessimism all the way to powerlessness. I like this because it gives you one person's position on how emotions can get more and more positive or more and more negative. But I don't think that this is necessarily the only perspective one can take. So a question that I get a lot when people look at this is, well, how do I know that this emotion is more positive than that emotion, or that this emotion is more negative than that emotion? And I think the answer really lies in the specific piece. If for Beethoven we see that the two themes are anger and love, all we have to do is figure out how those two emotions relate to one another. The joy is not a part of the equation. Grief is not a part of the equation. It's really anger, and the opposite of anger, in which for me it seems to be love, is the right opposition. And we're just trying to position these two emotions against one another. We don't have it. It's not an absolute truth perspective. This is the only way that this can go. It's really how you understand the emotions in the piece to relate to one another. Hopefully I'm expressing that right. Just move away from the idea that there is a correct placement of the circle and that there is a wrong place to place it. I think it's all about how you perceive the relationship between the emotions. But maybe it's important to mention here that what's important about this stage is that you see the entire piece, and that you see where you start, you see where you end, you see where the highest point, maybe the most positive point in the piece is, and maybe the most negative, the darkest point in the piece. And you sort of see the entire trajectory of that wave in one viewing. So a little bit like, yeah, Susan.
I just can say as a side story that I have a student who is almost 70, and she was an English teacher, and I always try to have her think of the pieces as a story.
Well, I missed the last sentence.
That's louder. She was an English teacher, a former student of mine, and I always try to tell her to think of the pieces as a story.
Yeah.
So she can relate. Yeah.
Right. And hold that thought, because there's a lot of truth in that, and there are some problems with the story. So yeah, maybe we should go in. Yes, absolutely. The story is something that holds us throughout the entire piece. The problem with the story is that the story has to match what the composer wanted us to express and not to become a point in itself. And for a lot of people, that area gets very blurry, and the story at some point becomes the focal point and not the music. So again, the balance between the two is really critical. Okay, very quickly, third step, boundaries. Why are boundaries important? Well, really, we already answered it in this example. If we start the piece with too much anger, there's nowhere to go. Or if we are not sure about how much anger and how to control that collapse, then we're going to we're not going to build the trajectory of the piece correctly. I guess I'm repeating myself, but think of Hamlet going on stage and sort of going full crazy right from the first scene. What is he going to do for the next 3 hours? The whole beauty of the play is that it spirals down and down and down and down. Also, you know, Breaking Bad is a wonderful example. The show is built with 7 seasons. Like every episode, things are getting progressively more and more and more and more bizarre and more crazy. If the actors can't control that gradual collapse of, you know, of ideals, of morality, there is no progression. There is no emotional trajectory. We are not going to be engaged. So this idea of boundaries is not only in terms of the piece, but it's also for us as performance to know, if I'm going to express anger in a Scarlatti sonata, how much anger does that really mean? It's a Baroque piece, was played on a harpsichord. How much ferociousness do I want to put into it? And I'll give more example in a second. I guess I want to just cover everything that is in the method first. And then we move into the connection part. And the connection part can be done in many, many different ways. Let's say we identify that the piece is about unrequited love. We have that experience in our past. Great. Instead of Chopin, it's now me narrating the piece about unrequited love and the sort of the misery and the pain and the longing that comes with it. If that's too much, I can decide that I'm going to just imagine one of my favorite movie stars or actors to be the narrator in the piece, and they're saying the monologue. For some people, this step is triggering is the wrong word, but it gets them very upset. They really do not want to become the narrator. They really don't want to be that specific about who is saying what. And they find that either colors can be very helpful, or just putting adjectives in the score. So you just say something like, this is tragic, this is hopeful, this is grieving, this is meltdown, this is, the epitome of joy. And that's enough. Just seeing the words in the score helps them connect to the emotion that they need to connect to. Again, there is no right and wrong here. There's just what works for you on stage, and especially under pressure. Let me emphasize that. This is all nice when we're in the practice room, but when you're on stage, the game is very, very different. And lastly, this is what Ezra was talking about, the disconnection. And again, the disconnection, it's a bad word. Maybe it should be changed to balance, or balance, finding the balance between how much emotion we need to express and where's that sweet spot where the audience is actually getting on board and where the audience is actually getting not wanting to come on board with us because what we're experiencing on stage is just too overwhelming for them. So the example that I like to give is, if somebody comes up to you and says, oh my God, my dog just died, and they're sort of hysterical about it, our reaction is to go like, whoa, I feel bad for you, but I don't want to engage with that emotional reality. But if somebody comes up to you and says, oh my God, my dog just died, you're like, oh, dude, what happened? The way that we deliver the emotion itself creates a reaction in the person receiving it. If we do too much, they're going to run away. If we don't do enough, they're going to be, if I went, oh, my dog just died, you're going to get no empathy or no response from the other person. Now, music is similar but different. Music actually, I think, has a lot more power to convey emotion. So sometimes just the harmonies and the rhythms are going to elicit a response from the audience without you doing anything. And sometimes if there's no emotional involvement from the performer, the audience is going to stay cold. I think that happens a lot with contemporary music. People go on stage, they just play the notes, but the audience stays flat because the performer is too scared to take an emotional position on the composition. I'm now debating that there should be a sixth stage to all of this, and that's going to be called adjustment. I don't think I've ever done this analysis on a piece of music that I didn't have to go back and do some sort of revision to what I thought the piece was about. And I think that's really important. I think that what we get as the first hit, or I think this piece is about X, it's about longing. And you think, oh, I'm going to use, my story with my first boyfriend that I felt really betrayed, and the longing for them to come back is going to work great. And then you play the piece and you realize, oh my God, this is really not working. It's not the right emotion. It's not the right story for it. It's not the right, I'm not in the right channel for this piece of music. And then what do? You have to adjust. You have to find something else. My favorite story to tell in this context is when I was learning, I'm going to stop the sharing. When I was learning Rachmaninoff third, and I thought I had a really wonderful interpretation for the whole thing, and I was really charged. And I go into the first run through of the thing, and I start playing. Literally by the third page, I knew I was in trouble. It wasn't enough. However much emotion I thought I had for the piece, I needed 10 times more. I had to go. Luckily for me, I had 3 months, so I went to the drawing board and I came up with a much bigger interpretation, much bigger emotions. I had to use a lot of imagination in there to get, to sustain the emotional energy for 45 minutes. But it really taught me an important lesson, is that the original point or position we take on the piece is not necessarily going to be where we end up. And it's okay to change, and it's okay to tweak, and it's okay to go back to square one and reinvent the entire interpretation. This is not science. This is not something that there is a right answer from the get-go. It will go through an evolution. It will go through a process. So I'm going to stop for a second and let you guys jump in with any questions you might have.
I was gonna say again, you said you might add another category of adjusting.
Yeah.
And I would think that I'm not really familiar with the world of elite performance, but I would think that those people can can adjust, and maybe you're interplaying with the conductor or even just the other musicians in a concerto for sure.
Yeah.
Because you can tell when the player is they're listening to each other and not.
Especially, it's a wonderful point, because in chamber music, the person you're playing with might not agree with you. So there's a question of does everybody on stage have to agree with each other about what the emotional content of the piece is? And I would say probably yes. You can't have two desperate opinions, but the connections can be very different. I can have a whole visual movie going in my head, and my colleague over there can just be thinking adjectives. Or it can happen on a very intuitive level where somebody is generating an emotion and the other person is just reacting to what is generated. But absolutely, I have a good point. Other people are going to influence your position on this for sure. Any other points? Yeah.
I think it's also important to note that how you connect to the piece can also change, because when I first started doing this work with you, I was very like the music was very specific for me. The more detailed, the better. And I would always like try to connect with like personal situations, and I was very much, it was just very, very detailed. Then as the years went on, I couldn't do that anymore. Like I could never figure out why, but I would try to do it and it wouldn't work. So I just had to move to like more general images or colors or other things that would work, because I couldn't do it anymore.
Yeah, and the strength of the connection is really important. We'll talk about that in a second. But if the connector is not strong enough under pressure, or if you feel too vulnerable to think about, a family member who died on stage, I mean, of course, it would be too traumatizing. It's too difficult. You can't use that as a connector, right? You can use the color black as the connector. I think the thing that I do a lot was, and still do, maybe it's a personal story, but instead of me being the narrator, I give it to a singer I like to be the narrator. They're using my emotions, but they're the ones saying it. So there's a level, and this goes back to your question, Ezra. There's another level of detachment in what's happening, because I'm no longer the person saying it, if that makes sense. So I want to go. Your question was a good one. So how can we practice detachment? Video camera. Because when you put yourself, when you tape yourself and you will know exactly where you're crossing the boundary. For some people, me, it's usually too much. I'm doing too much. It's getting too intense. It's getting too overwhelming. Pull it back. For some other people, it's like, oh boy, this is not working at all. I'm not even close to where it needs to be in terms of intensity level. What I just mentioned about the narrator or the speaker in the music becoming somebody other than you, in some cases, using a past experience, but something that happened like in the far past, not something that happened last week, but something that happened a year ago, would be very helpful, because you've processed it, you've internalized it, you can now use it as fuel for the music you're performing. I've noticed that for some people, the colors are very, very helpful. Colors help you connect to the emotion, but it's not specific. So it's there, but you're not overwhelmed by it. If you want it to be more, you can enhance the color. You want to be less, you can diffuse the color. And lastly, the adjectives. For some people, the adjectives are really, really powerful, because just thinking of the word grief gets them into where they need to go. I would also say that for somebody like me, the adjectives really don't work, because I want to know why the word is there. So if there's grief at the beginning and then joy later, so what happened that now this was this and this is that now? What's the connection? So yeah. So
I can say something else, because I'm older now. Okay, I'm 53. And I've come back, I've been at Fredonia for 1.5 years now, playing again where I studied. And so as you get older and you haven't had lessons and you haven't like really thought a lot about everything, but you're reacting to the notes on the page. And in the moment, I guess I've experienced that I'm just trying to be real and do what's on the page and try to think why did the composer do this? And, you know, and then I just off on my box of tools as far as being musical and just trying to execute, you know, using all of those things that I learned 30 years ago.
Right.
And, but being real in the moment, for me, that's where I'm at. I don't know.
So when you say being really in the moment, does that include emotion, or that sort of precludes emotion because you just need to play the notes?
It's kind of just, I'm just being me in the moment, and some of, you know, all of the experiences emotionally I've had, especially the past 10 years, you know, that really try you, they're just there. And
Right.
for me, the music is a way to just let it go and exist,
Beautiful.
connect.
Beautiful.
with
So again,
people.
and I think for most of us sensitive folk, the connection between music and emotion is something that happens very naturally.
Mhm.
The reason why this method was brought forth was because when I would go on stage and I would want to express something that was very easy for me to do in the practice room, I felt that there was a problem, there was a wall. All of a sudden, my brain is like, oh my God, everybody's watching me. I hope that I'm going to hit all the right notes. I hope that, you know, I'm not going to have a memory slip. And instead of focusing on the emotional drama, I'm now focusing on something that's completely irrelevant. Which leads me to the next point, which is,
I actually have a question.
yeah, please.
I don't know if my question is related or not. I'm sorry about that, but when my problem is when I play, I get very emotional
Mhm.
and I connect with that. But when I get too emotional, my body sometimes just goes into kind of panic and has a hard time getting out of it. And that's probably one of the part of the problem. I panic a little bit when I playing, you know, in a stage, because I like constantly connecting it with emotions, and I don't know. I mean, like, how do I pull back and just breathe and then, you know, not get worried and then being able to finish it without.
Beautiful, beautiful question. It goes to what, you know, to what Ezra was saying. It's about the detachment. It's about finding the balance between how much emotion I need to put in and where is that sweet spot where I actually have to stop. And it's not going to happen overnight. God knows it took me about 20 years to figure out how to do it. But the good news is this. The good news is that you already have a rich internal world with so much emotion and so much ideas and so much imagination. It's already activated. It's already happening. What you have to figure out is how much of it is useful and at what point it's too much. So if you think of a water container, that's the structure of the music. If it's sonata form or rondo form or whatever you have, the container is the plastic or the wood that is holding the water. The emotion is the water that we add. And what you're describing is, I can't stop adding water. Right? And so my advice would be, again, videotaping or really thinking about, okay, what images am I using? And at what point do I feel that it gets too much? And maybe I can use something like colors, or maybe I can use something like a point in the story that stops the expression of emotion. Let me see if I can give you a good example.
So think about something that will not get me too emotional, but that will just kind of get me out of it, but still connect to the emotion, like a little safer than personal experience or imagination. But like you mentioned, color, I can just fall back. Like, I don't know, I can think about impressionism. I don't know, pictures I see Monet or whatever. Yeah.
It's very difficult and it's very personal. So I'm not sure that me answering it right now in this this session is what's going to solve it for you. But here's what I would do. If you're playing something that is very sad and the connector that you're using is a breakup that you've experienced in the past, and you're telling me right now it gets too much. So point number one, maybe don't use that connector. It's too much. It's too intense. Two, maybe if you use a different breakup with somebody else that wasn't that tragic, or maybe decide that instead of you in that story, somebody else is portraying you. So you have, actress, whatever, Jane Smith doing your part in that scene with that person. So it's not just you. You take the director's seat instead of being an actor in the scene. Sometimes the thing to do is to put stops in the story. So there's like a little bit of a scene and then you cut to a different scene. So you're not constantly in one scene in the story, sort of milking that scene for what it's worth. Does that sound like something you can try?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll try that. Thank you.
Any other questions about this? I'll go to the, okay. This is, again, the whole purpose of this talk is that when you think about the expressing emotion in music, for most of us in the practice room, this is not an issue. We love the music, we're moved by the music, not a lot has to happen for us to want to be engaged with it. The problem is really when we go on stage and now there is the pressure of people observing us, ranking us, whichever terminology you want to use, and you still have to express those emotions, right? They're judging me while I'm expressing vulnerability. They're judging me while I'm trying to be happy. They're judging me while I'm trying to move them to tears because it's a really sad piece. That's really where the bigger friction happens. And the way I like to talk about it is in terms of which energy is stronger. You see the audience in front of you and you think, oh my God, all these people have this massive energy and it's all judgment. And me, little me, is going on stage and I'm going to have to convince them that Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star is the most joyful piece they've ever heard. Right? You see the problem. Me over here and this massive energy over here. Which energy is stronger? Anybody? Right. They're much stronger. How on earth am I going to convince them that Claire de Lune is a heavenly piece when they have all this energy? And when you think of young children, I saw this now in this competition. You think of a young child going on stage in front of 30, 40 people. What do they think they're experiencing? If we didn't give them the tools, if we didn't tell them, you have to tell the story. This is what this Twinkle Twinkle is all about. Think about, candy. Think about visiting grandma. Think about something that makes you happy, and then share that with all these people. They have a fighting chance. They might not be able to do it, but they have a fighting chance. But if we just send them out there without the connector, they're going to be overwhelmed by the energy they're experiencing by all those people who are observing them. So the analogy that I like to use here is having to take the elevator to the right floor. The methodology helps us decide what floor we're going to. Maybe if we're playing Berg Sonata, we have to press the basement and then the sub-basement and go really, really, really low because it's a very depressing piece. If we're playing Twinkle Twinkle, okay, let's go to floor number 5. If we're playing Schubert Wanderer Fantasy, Penthouse. We decide what floor we're going to. In the practice room, we practice finding that connector, finding the board with the buttons, pressing the button, taping ourselves, making sure that we actually at the place that we want to get to, and we create the interpretation. That way, that when we go on stage and we are overwhelmed by other people's emotions, I'm pressing 20 right now, I'm pressing the basement, I'm pressing level 5. I know where I'm going. And then comes the part that we have to come up with so much ammunition, with so much emotion that whatever reality we are creating, at least balances with this, if not, pushes it completely out of the picture. Now, if you think of your favorite performer, you think of your favorite actor, your favorite musician, you will see that they do exactly that. They go on stage and they create so much energy with their presence, nothing can coexist with that energy. You think of Maria Callas going and singing an aria. There's nobody more important in the room than she is. And it's not an ego thing. It's not that singers usually carry themselves with a very strong ego, but it's not an ego thing. She's so committed to the part that she's playing, to the emotion that she's expressing, that nobody else's emotion matters. And if you can take that understanding, that's a really, really important winning strategy to go on stage and give compelling performances, because you realize the emotional reality you're presenting is much more important than the judgment and the ranking and the blah, 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 and the stress and the fear. Is it easy to do? Heck no. Very, very difficult. But the strong, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I can add that. Did you say Maria Callas?
Yeah.
So she's working with words. right? And so mostly what I do now is I work with singers and there's words right there.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times we're just reacting and interpreting the words. And so translating that to a piece without words, sometimes again going back to that story, you know, you could, like you said, adjectives or
They have-
associate words with
It's
it.
true. They have a much easier time in that respect, but I would also say that it's a trap. Because if you have to sing, if you're the queen of the night and you have to go, and do that, even though you have words and it's about Zarathustra and the blah, 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 maybe you don't really connect to that. But you still have to say those words and you have to figure out a connector around those words to get you to the point that you're, you know.
Yeah.
Of course, it's even worse when you're singing in a foreign language that you don't really understand. And now you have to have it's like triple layer. The words you're singing, what they mean, but then maybe they don't mean anything to you anyways, and you still have to have another layer underneath that. So again, it's a double-edged sword. Any other comments, questions about this? Okay, I want to talk about being overwhelmed on stage, which maybe relate to what Anne was asking previously. So one of my biggest discoveries from doing this was that my memory slips always happened when I was emotionally overwhelmed. And emotionally overwhelmed, why? Because there was a strong transition in the music going from one emotion to another. Now it not necessarily from bad to good or from good to bad. Whatever transition happened was for me a potential disaster area. Ask me why? Because once you've spent time establishing one emotional reality, why on earth would you want to leave it? And I know it's sort of an irrational thought, but if you spend the entire exposition of a Mozart sonata being like all bubbly and fun, and all of a sudden he does this modulation, and all of a sudden you're in despair, you don't want to go down. And guess what my memory slip was? When he wanted to go back up. It's like, dude, you're not doing it to me twice. You can take me down, we'll stay down, but you're not taking me back up again. And when I looked at that point and I asked myself, like, why on earth would one have a memory slip in a simple modulation from G back to C? There was really no reason for it whatsoever. And the only reason that suddenly clicked was, oh, it was too sudden. I wasn't ready for that. Oh, and now we're happy again. It was too much of a contradiction for my personality to go from, he goes very deep in the C major sonata, he goes F minor, it gets really, really dark very fast. And within 2 measures, he's like, oh, but I'm happy again. And that yo-yo aspect of the sonata was enough to cause me a memory slip. Another aspect of this is that, and I think it ties to what Anne was saying, you're going on stage with so much sensitivity, with so much emotion, that you suddenly can't access it, or it completely obliterates the piece. Instead of it being about the Schumann sonata, it becomes about you expressing your anger. Or instead of it being about something being heavenly, you sort of disengage because you can't get to that level of spirituality or religion or God. It's just too far, and you get overwhelmed. So I think the drawing of the circles and seeing these lines really helps you understand where those trouble spots might be, where you might be touching on an emotion you're not comfortable with. Maybe the amount of it are not going to be comfortable, and making, doing the preparation ahead of time to know this could be potentially problematic. We're playing right now with Natasha this Prokofiev ballad, maybe one of the darkest pieces I've ever played. And not only is it dark, it's heavy, and it starts with some level of optimism and just ends in this really, really depressing place. And just to show you how complex this project, I know what I think the piece is about, and I'm still tweaking. I'm not comfortable. I don't know if we can go there on stage. I don't know if I can get that depressed playing in front of the student body and my colleagues. Can we really go to this very dark place that Prokofiev wants us to go? And so keep tweaking the image, keep recording, keep saying, are we close? Are we there? Are we too much? Like, where exactly are we when it comes to expressing these dark emotions? Maybe a follow-up question is, do people usually have problem with positive emotions or with negative emotions? My position is I've seen people struggle with both. It's not that, of course, negative emotions. No, some people have a much easier time with the negative, much harder time with the positive. All right. Any questions about any of this?
I have something to say about the last point with the audience.
Yeah.
It's not so much, I guess it's not as applicable to like I guess like performing classical music as it is to like, I don't know, pop music, but I also feel like from moving from classical to like pop, I kind of made myself shut myself off from the audience. But I found that like when I'm playing my own music, it is a lot nicer to like feed off of the audience, because if they're all like cheering in the middle of a song or like after a song, it's really nice. And it's also like, it's because like I'm playing with no one on stage. So in order to feed off of some energy, so I'm not all by myself up there, like it is nice to harness the energy of a crowd as opposed to like when you're playing with bandmates. Like been watching a lot of live performances, and I watched like Vinny Colaiuta and Chick Corea and some other bass dude play, and they're just all feeding off of each other. So I feel like that's another point to be made.
For sure. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, because I think this is really interesting. Because it's your music, it's your song, it's your lyrics, it's something that it's a part of your entire DNA. You are the composer. There's no way in hell that you'll ever be disconnected from it.
Yeah.
There you go. But to me, that's it. There's that basic issue we talked about. You walking out there and saying, no, my emotional reality is going to be much more important. It's me. You're experiencing me. So if you like me, thumbs up. If you don't, tough noogies. Like, you're going to have to deal with it. It's different than when you're going on stage with a Beethoven sonata or something that is somebody else's, and you need to bring it in and say, no, this is mine. I'm standing here for the composer. I'm the channel that is holding this energy for them. And I believe in 120% in every note that I'm playing. Again, I think singers, for the most part, have an easier time with the audience in that circle of energy.
Yeah.
Don't ask me why. I'm not sure why. I think that instrumentalists, maybe because we're not sure if we're right about what the music is saying, or maybe it's the fact that the music is made outside of us rather than our own throat. There's a level of physicality that singers have that is so much more immediate and poignant than we do as pianists or violinists. So maybe that's another aspect of it.
I would think also like facing the instrument, because I mean, if you're a singer, you're not like facing the side, but like, I mean, I guess that doesn't necessarily matter, because I'll still be facing the crowd and looking down at the keys.
Right. And I know that singers most of the time are told, look at the box above people's heads, or sort of, if you're in an opera, you're not looking them straight in the eye. You're in the character. So again, it can work. It can work and it can backfire.
Yeah.
I remember once somebody told me there was a violinist who kept insisting on making eye contact with the audience, thinking that was a good thing. It was very disturbing. It's like, are you playing right now, or are you staring at us? Like, which one are you doing? So
sometimes it's that's also a double-edged sword, because I'll get distracted if I like make eye contact with someone and just they're making a face back at me.
Right. Any other questions? I know this is a huge topic, so hopefully I give you guys a lot to think about, but anything that you're grappling with your own pieces or with students that you feel like, what do I do? What do you do when I have a 6-year-old? Do we analyze the piece? Kim, what do you do with your young students?
Well, a lot of them, I don't know. I was actually thinking about that during this Zoom meeting, that I want to try more with them to see like what would happen if I did this. Because I feel like so far none of them have really been ready to do that. It's still very much like,
How do I play? Yeah.
How do I play? Where are the notes? But I have a few that I think I could start doing this with. So I think that I will. But it also, I have to like separate myself from what, for example, like if I do this like with these really simple songs, like I'm gonna be like, this is ridiculous. But they might be like, see it as a whole nother thing. So I have to make sure that I separate myself from it and just let them.
Right. Right. And just have fun seeing what their imagination tells them about the music. You might be surprised. I remember when I used to do it with the kids on Lucy Moses, I was always surprised by how imaginative they got, you know, and sort of allowing them to free their imagination as they're playing. It's maybe that's the first step. Maybe it's not even about it's being happy or sad. What do you see when you play this music? And then when you go on stage, let your imagination be a part of what you're doing. Maybe it's not even about the specificity of happy or sad, maybe just imagination, right?
I actually have an exercise for this.
Oh.
So there is this piece that, you know, those like little Japanese Takashi Yoshimatsu pieces?
Yeah.
I'd take a short one and at the beginning of the lesson, I'd tell my students, sit down. I'd start playing the piece, and these were really easy because I could just vamp because there's like 2 bars you could do the sentence over. And I would build a storyline for them, and I'd be like, you're walking through a forest. Is it daytime or nighttime? And I would vamp until they would answer. And when they answer, I go to the next part and be like, all right, it's nighttime. There's birds around. Like, what are the birds doing? Are they singing? Are they swooping around? And they would answer. And I would do this for the whole piece. And by the end, they would have a journey through the forest. They're like, relax. They're like, yeah, I'm ready to learn. And that might translate into like their silly little pieces, but you know, giving them options.
I love it. I
yeah.
love it. That's fantastic. I wish we were all as creative as Ezra to vamp with it, to let them imagine the story. Do you feel like the problem then when they get to Mozart or to a classical composer that their imagination is inhibited, or do you feel that it's a natural flow from?
I feel like it's probably, as long as you don't do like any describing, I feel like staying away from talking about the piece and just playing the music and structuring a basic outline of the story, but then like deciding what happens in the story helps. I think I just like really gave a convoluted answer, but
Okay.
no, I don't think so.
My expertise is to give convoluted answers, so you're in the right place. No, I think it's important that we just open that door for them. I mean, the kids that you're teaching are maybe not even aware that that there is a right or wrong, but when you get to like, 12, 13 and older, and they start thinking, wait, did Mozart mean that? If Mozart didn't mean that, I'm not doing it type mentality. I think that's maybe even more important that you say it's whatever's happening in your head as you're playing this is cool.
Mm-hmm.
As long as it matches the emotional content in the music. And which actually leads me to an important point to make. I remember a masterclass where I was playing Prokofiev 6 Piano Sonata, considered one of the war sonatas, and the opening apparently is all about tanks and sirens going on. And the person giving the masterclass was asking me, so what do you think this opening is about? And I said, it's a devilish dance. Bam, ba-da-dum. I like the up feeling of that opening, and it seemed to me like, hell is having a party, a rave, and things are happening in that rave. And the look of disgust on this professor's face was so, hurtful. Like he could not imagine that I was desecrating the music of Prokofiev by imagining something that was not war and tanks. And right there and then I learned maybe the most important lesson in all of this. Never do that. Whatever the person is saying to you is what they're feeling is happening in the music. And that's their prerogative. They're the performer. If they want to make it into a rave in hell, good for them. Oh, Susan coming back. Whatever is happening, you need to support them. You need to let them use the imagination. Now, there's a pedagogical way of saying to somebody like me at that point, saying it's a rave in hell, to say, well, that's really cool. You're probably reacting to the rhythms and the dissonances and the staccatos, and that's interesting. And of course, that he wrote this during the war. So his position was that it was about the tanks, and sort of bringing that in and having the performer choose, do you want to go with the war interpretation or do you want to do your own thing? Maybe there's a meeting place between the two. With age, or 20 years later, I realized that I really wanted the opening of that piece to be heavier than what I was doing originally when I was in my 20s. We mature, we change, we learn. But to go to somebody and say, no, this is not the way this goes, is not the way I suggest we teach. But yeah, that's my own perspective. Other questions, and we'll wrap it up.
I have a question. I lost my internet for a minute there. Sorry.
No worries.
Have you listened to many performers? So I missed what you were talking about, but I heard the ending there. Have you listened to many performers play the same piece, in their 20s versus the 40s, 50s? Have you done that as part of this study?
So I was going to play the Chopin mazurka for all of you with Rubinstein and Horowitz, just so you see how, oh my God, their interpretation couldn't be more different. And yet both are brilliant and both are valid. Or if you take, another favorite example, Glenn Gould's Goldberg variations versus, Andres Schiff's. The beauty of music is that you have this composer's DNA being matched with all of these different performers' perspective on that. And there are all these different facets of the piece that we get to experience because there are different performers expressing them. And there is Martha Argerich's Ravel Concerto, that I adore. And there's Michelangelo Ravel's Concerto, which I also adore. The step that I want to stress here is not that there is a right thing, but that if you investigate the music, you can come up with your own position on the text and make a much more compelling interpretation. Not that there is a right or better or more successful or less. That's a really dangerous discussion. Again, who am I to say that one thing is more effective emotionally and another thing is not? I mean, that's just my subjective position. I don't know. Does that kind of answer it? I guess my point is I'm always amazed that I can be moved by completely different performances of the same piece.
Again, part of my question was having heard from performers at different stages in their lives. And I think, just getting rid of all judgment and judging you and being who you are in the moment, that doesn't matter. Like, forget about all the judges. Just be you in the moment. I mean, with all the study behind it, with all of the,
Right. I think that's that's the important part. As long as you study the score and you believe that your position on it is created after careful consideration of what you've deduced from the score, then yes, then that's all you can bring. Again, somebody asked me, I don't remember where it was, but they asked me, must you have the emotional experience of the music in your life in order to play the music? It's a little bit like, can you portray Hamlet unless your father was murdered by your uncle? No, you can relate to the emotions in the piece without having a direct experience of those emotions, because we're human beings, so we can imagine, we can make connections. Maybe it's not going to be exactly the same, but it's going to be close enough that you can portray the emotions. Maybe it's my favorite sentence. Like, do you have to think about the moon when you play Clair de Lune? No, you don't. Who knows even if the title is important? We know the Moonlight Sonata Beethoven, like some editor put the moonlight there. We have to be very careful that we don't get stuck with, semantics and with agenda put by others onto the music, and just find our own personal subjective connection to it that we can justify in the music. I guess maybe the other extreme, I think that's the first step. You can be wrong. You can say that Ode to Joy is a tragic piece. It's not a tragic piece. It's Ode to Joy. You can mislabel it. That's absolutely a pitfall that we should avoid. But within the right spectrum of interpretation, there are a lot of options. So whatever you feel in the moment based on your experience, and that's what you go with.
Also, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Susan, to give you an example of like the age difference of someone performing a piece then and now, again, it's not a classical example, but I've been listening to a lot of Sting. So I was watching Vinnie Colaiuta and Sting play 7 Days, and like the recording, great song. And then I wanted to do him live because my drum teacher said that he would go fucking crazy. Sorry, he would go crazy live. So like much later, very much more recent. So, but I mean, like 2007. So I guess not super recent. I think there is a recording of him playing live, and yeah, he was going absolutely insane. But like you could just tell that that song sit much more in himself, and he was able to like just give more of himself. Like I guess there's like a not naivety, but like just youth, and then like yeah, like this is mine, and I built this all the way up.
I
So
love
yeah.
I love that. And again, because it's their own material, there's maybe more permission to be more to investigate how deep and how, you know, and actually that's a really important point we haven't spoken about. Like, do you, let's say you found that connector to the piece and now you have to perform it 8 times. Do you perform it always the same? Do you always use the same connector? And I can tell you from experience is that in some cases you want to, because even if you try to do the same thing 8 times in a row, there's no way you can. And in some cases, after the 8th time, you go, if I think about that storyline one more time, I'm going to go crazy. And you have to change. You have to reinvent the wheel. So, yeah, there's a lot there to investigate. All right, we're a little after 12, so I'm going to finish this for now. I hope you all enjoyed this discussion. I know this is one of my favorite things to talk about. I guess the next time is going to be probably in 2 weeks, but I'll post about that. There are links here in the chat if you want to see more. There's a link to the map, and there's a link to a YouTube that I talk about the entire methodology if you want to look at that as well. And of course, if you have any questions, just shoot me an email. I'll be happy to answer. Okay, thank you. Bye, everybody. Unless there are more questions. Any questions? No? Yeah, maybe? Okay. Bye.